It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Richard Abidin to speak with us about the Parenting Stress Index. Dr. Abidin got his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate at Rutgers University, and then worked at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. And then in the 60s founded the Clinical and School Psychology program here at Curry, where he continued to work for many years, including serving as the director of the program and working with the clinic. Dr. Abidin's also worked on state, regional, national organizations, including a lot of work with APA, and being one of the founders of a couple of journals, a member of the Virginia Board of Psychology, a founding member of the Virginia Association of School Psychologists. He's worked with a couple of divisions in APA. He worked with the Oakland School here in Virginia from the time it started in the 60s and has been actively involved with them. He's also worked on a number of other tests, including the Early Childhood Parenting Skills Program, the Parenting Alliance Measure, the Stress Index for Parents of Adolescents, and the Index of Teaching Stress. He's also worked on a number of journals and served as an editor, so we're really lucky to have him here today. So please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is kind of a special thing for me, having retired from the university a while ago, as Ron just reminded me. So I haven't really been in a kind of official role of being something of a teacher. But I do appreciate you coming, and I hope that what we do today will be useful to you. I want to do something which I find is customary. When clinical child psychologists give talks, they generally give pictures of their children, kind of to prove that we know something about children. In my case, I don't really like hanging around with old people, so instead what I'm going to do is give you a picture of my grandchildren. So we have 9, and these are my grandchildren. I'll leave this up as I just structure what we're going to do today. There will be a break. There is some paper on the side there for you to sign up. I will give you the complete text of this report and the PowerPoint presentation. So you don't really have to take any unnecessary notes. You'll have it all. In addition to that, you will have a document which contains all of the references to the things I say, because one of the points I want to make is that the research which we'll be covering is research that has been done by colleagues of mine. And when you're talking about your own test, you know, I know I'm going to be blowing my own horn a little bit here. It's hard not to. But what I chose to do was, other than the construction of the test, I'm citing none of my own research or none of my students' research. So this is out of the 1,500 or so published articles on parenting stress is where I drew these articles from. So that provides the context. So let me give a little background to the concept of parenting stress as I've worked on developing it, and as well as the measure. To begin with, as I indicated, we have 9 grandchildren, but while we were an undergraduate and graduate school, Mary and I had 4 children. So I know a little bit about taking care of children under stress. And as indicated earlier, I worked in the Department of Psychiatry for 3 years at Wilford Hall Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, most closely with the pediatricians there. And there's one person I want to recognize in that experience base, and that was Dr. Julian Haber. He and I would work together, and one day he was saying, you know, Dick, I would like to provide some anticipatory guidance to parents who are having a difficult time. And how do I know they have really a difficult time? So he says, could you give me 4 or 5 questions that I could ask, and that way I would know how to sort out which parents to work with a little more intensively or to make a referral. Anyway, it was a good idea, I never accomplished anything on that, but it's stuck in the back of my mind. And then when I accepted the position to UVA, I was really fortunate. There was a group in town called Pediatric Associates, and they really were my boosters and supporters in the creation of this instrument. And one of the doctors, who is the daughter of one of the men I work with, Dr. Vito Periello, is here with us today, Paige. So I owe them a thanks. They're a great group of guys. And what was interesting is that we were doing things that we now call integrative health care. We didn't know that. We just thought it was we were doing service, to the people. I'll say one thing about it quickly, because it helps you see where this measure came from. When I worked there, I had my own office in the practice. The pediatricians in the examining rooms, one of them was actually two of the examining rooms were dedicated to this project called the Parenting Clinic. We would provide evaluations. We began the idea of building up a measure that could be used for screening and diagnostic purposes to help identify parents who would need services. The thing that was beautiful about the experience was that we worked on a 40-minute hour, okay? 5 to 10 minutes was putting your notes into the medical record. So when the physicians would come, they would see what happened in every psychologist session. Also, because we had this block of time, we had the referral system where you just walk the patient down to our office to meet the doctor. And so the handoff was like 99% of the referrals were completed and people followed up. This is what we just thought ought to be done. And anyway, what was neat was, as a psychologist, I was learning a lot of medicine. I don't claim to know much about medicine, but you can't help but learn something when you read the records of what the disorders are, what the physician is saying, or what the medications are. It's a wonderful way to practice. I recommend it to you if you are so inclined. Okay. So the main message of the workshop today is that I'd like to present evidence that the construct of parenting stress is a central and powerful variable that should be a part of all screening of family child assessments and is useful in treatment planning. So that'll be the first part, covering the research to support that notion. And then the second part of this will be have a break. We'll be going over case material, profiles, and et cetera. So, the construct of parenting stress. These are the points I'll cover, and this is the structure of the presentation. Construct of parenting stress, the model that was used to guide research and clinical work, the validity studies supporting the construct's importance. Then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll do the interview, or rather the interpretation and review of cases. Okay. The construct of parenting stress. It's a kind of a useful idea, I think, in helping us to understand, and as you'll see, I focus on observed behaviors versus other test scores or other kinds of outcomes. I'm focused always on, and all the research that we'll present is focused on demonstrating scores' direct linkage to observed behavior or to a child outcome that's objective or to hormonal levels. There will be objective criteria, all of the research. Now, when I think of parenting stress, I've come to believe that it is the G factor of parenting. Just like in intelligence, there is a G factor which correlates to all human learning and performance. And this seems to be true And I think the research demonstrates it, and as we go through the research, you'll come to see the broad basis of which parenting stress scores link to all of these observed behaviors. In point of fact, I think it's such a powerful variable that when many researchers use parenting stress as a variable in their research, it generally is the, as one would expect if it was a G factor, the variable that accounts for the largest portion of variance in the dependent variable. So therefore, most of the time I tell researchers, don't enter it first if you're interested in other variables. You have to enter it last. We already know its importance. What we need to know is something about some of these other variables that may be useful in helping us to predict parenting behavior or various outcomes. So what is parenting stress? It's a psychological mindset. It's also a state of arousal. We know, and we'll talk about it briefly, that cortisol levels are related to stress, and they are related to, obviously, to parenting stress. So parenting stress is a mindset and a physiological state that the parent is in while they're engaging in the role of parent, and they're coping with the behaviors of their child and fulfilling their responsibilities within the role. Parenting stress is not an ephemeral variable. That is, it's stable over fairly prolonged periods of time, but it is subject to change by outside influences such as change of income, loss of a job, deaths in a family, a variety of other life events that will impact the stress of a parent. And as you'll see when we talk about the test more specifically, all of the measure of the test, this normal scales we use, also are embedded in a life stress assessment that we conduct at the same time, so that we know a little bit about the different dimensions of parenting stress, but we also understand it within a context, and the context being various life stresses. So why is assessment of parenting stress important? Well, one of the things it does is it gives us some insights into parent-child interactions, to the family dynamics, to relationships within the couple, if there is one supporting the child. And it's important because it's a variable that pulls us away from saying, oh, we're going to study this child or study the family or the parent. It is a variable that is very transactional. It's very important to understand parenting stress as it exists and operates within transactions, both parent to child and parent to parent. And all these statements I'm making now, you'll see the research as I begin to present it supports those statements, that it is important in parent to parent, that it is important in parent to child. The other portion that's important of the parenting stress is that it helps us to identify what might be considered dysfunctional parenting ideas. Because of the nature of the measure and the questions we raise, it gives us an insight into what the parent is thinking and how they're thinking. It also gives us targets for intervention. As you'll see, as we break down the scales and the names of the scales, you'll see that they are points that one can intervene psychosocially for a psychosocial intervention. So it's going to help you target areas that aren't going well and that may need an intervention or some support. And the final thing, I think, is that if we don't understand the parents' cognitions, where they're coming from, how they're perceiving their child, how they're perceiving themselves and their spouses, if we don't know these things, we're going to be in a situation where we're going to find often, or on occasion at least, parents who are not going to be supportive of whatever intervention we choose. Because if they don't have a sense you really understand their reality, where they are in their life circumstance in relation to this child, despite the fact that we may know an intervention that works very well, at least the literature tells us this is an evidence-based effective treatment, that doesn't mean they're going to participate in it. And so one of the things that the PSI does for us, and you'll see in the research I provide as we go on, is that it predicts people's participation or withdrawal from treatment, and it also predicts medical compliance, adherence to medical regimes that are specified for the care of the child. That's important. That's a little bit more about this is the basic model that we came up with. In the 1970s, it seems like such a long time ago, but in the 1970s, 80s, my students and I, we were working on this issue of can we find ways to find a measure that would help us better understand parents' behavior and be able to predict parents' behavior. And so we began a review of the research, all these little 3x4 or 5 cards. We'd read articles. We would get the variable that was under consideration, and if we thought one was maybe useful in being a predictor, we'd keep that variable. So that was one way we began. The second way that we began was the good fortune of working with pediatric associates, because we now had real live parents who were there. And one of the ideas we came up with was that we would make our services available. Well, we were charging fees. The deal was very good. The pediatric associates was reimbursed a certain portion of everything we billed. I think they got 70%, and the university got the other 30%. Actually, our clinic got the other 30%. I think that's how it was, but I don't quote me on those figures. But but it was a shared endeavor, and one of the things that we did was with the endorsement of the pediatrician, which is powerful, believe me, when you're dealing with particularly parents of young children. When a physician says, well, it might be good for you to cooperate or help or work with this person, that was a big endorsement, and parents would work with us. And one of the things we asked them to do was to keep logs, okay? And the logs would be what they experienced daily that they found in coping with their child to be stressful on them. What were the problems they encountered? And we had these logs, and they would bring them in, and that was a part of the process of us seeing them. So that was our payback. So we had a partnership, and it also made it easier for the parent to relate to the psychologist, because we were kind of partners in it. Another part of the partnership was that we would make audio tapes so that whatever the psychologist told, most of the times it was a mother, 95% of the time it was a mother. Whatever I would be talking to this parent about, recommending for the care of their child, or to a way to behave or interact differently, or to be supportive of the mother, she could play that back to hear it again as many times as she wanted. As I said, these are short sessions, sometimes only 30 minutes. But so could her significant other spouse. And what it did was connect things. The other thing which we did was we had, in between sessions, we had a scheduled phone call. It was either I or the student who was with me who would make that call. What it did was I used to say, it created a bigger awareness that we were with that person, with that family, than the typical situation where you see him for 50 minutes and then you don't see him for another week, and then the appointment is broken and it's 2 weeks and there's no connection. So we had this connection, and that's part of why these people filled out, and candidly filled out these things. I remember one mother's comment. She was talking about her son, how what a wonderful child he was, and this and that. She said, but, you know, sometimes, as wonderful as he is, I kind of wish he lived next door. And, you know, it's true. I think we've all been there, been parents. So this is the model that we wound up with. And what it does is it suggests that if you look at the model, that at the bottom, child outcomes is a function of child characteristics and dysfunctional parenting. And then you get to, and the mediating variable of the whole process is the parent's characteristics, the child's characteristics, and the socioeconomic environment that they're a part of. That's what influences the parenting stress predominantly. Now, obviously, you can think of many other variables than we have in this model. Okay, what we were concerned about was finding variables, and I'm going to give you now the more detailed version of this model, that were ones that were potentially susceptible to psychosocial intervention. I mean, there are certain things we can't change. If you know, so certainly if a mother is physically disabled, we can't change that. Okay. And yes, we know it's related to making life more difficult to fulfill the role of a parent. So we were looking at things that you could change. So that was part of our thinking when we were kind of developing the measure. You'll learn more about these child characteristics and parent characteristics as we go on, but those are really the subscales. So if you look at the PSI, the test, it's structured like the Wechsler intelligence test. You get a total score. You get 2 domain scores, one parent characteristics, child characteristics domain, okay? And they sum to make the total. Below each of the 2 domains are subscales, which are labeled as they appear there, okay? Now you see that these are kind of different labels. They're not DSM labels. There are labels that relate to characteristics of both the parent or the child that are likely to be influencing the parent-child transaction. Okay, so that's what those things are. Okay, and we'll learn a little bit more about them as we kind of move forward. Now, the parents, when they're asked to respond to the test questions in the questionnaire, they're asked not as to whether or not, like on the Achenbach, whether something is present, but rather they're asked in relation to the STEM, how distressing this is to you. You know, I learned this, it's true in both parenting and with teachers, same thing. A child may be active and more active than normal, and some people, that's very distressing, and other people, it's not. There's a lot of the stimulus of the world has to be processed cognitively, and then its value or impact occurs. But it goes through a process of thinking, and in this case, we're trying to get at the issue of how much it impacts you. So an example of a question like that would be, my child is so active, it exhausts me. Okay? So you're saying it's not that the child's active, it's that it has that impact on the parent. We'll go through the interpretation later, but you'll see we tried to make this interpretation of the subscales have a high level of face validity. So basically, when you're looking at them, you see those labels there for the subscales. That's pretty much what they are designed to tap. Okay. Now, the PSI comes in two versions. One is a 101-item long form with 19 separate items, which are the life stress, which forms the context for understanding the measure. But there is a short form of 36 items with 3 scales. And those 3 scales have to do with child characteristics, parental distress, and transactional distress. And there are 12 items in each of those 3 categories. And they sum for the total. So, there we go. And what I just said. Okay. So we're going to talk about the validity research on the parenting stress. And these are the categories that we're going to cover. We're going to cover observed parenting behavior, the physical health of the parent, the child academic functioning, parent compliance with prescribed behavioral and medical care, quality of the parent-child relationship, and marital relationship. And so those are the areas that we want to cover. Okay. So let's launch into it. The earliest scientific indication that the PS, parenting stress, is predictive of observed parenting behavior came from 2 studies that were done by Eric Mash and Charlotte Johnson, published in 1983. What they demonstrated was that the parenting stress was predictive of abusive parents' behavior towards their children when they were placed in free play or a task situation requiring cleanup of materials. Now, the parents in this study were administered the PSI before the task situations. All the interactions between parent and children were videotaped. They were then coded, and they were coded for both positive and negative behaviors. What was interesting was found that there was no difference in the children's behavior, whether they had been abused or not, in the free play or the task situation. Children's behavior in that context remained fairly similar. What there was found was that there was a significant difference in the parent's behavior. And that is that when a parent, if they have a history of abuse, has a child in a free play situation, all you have to do is watch. You don't have to do anything. Everything's okay. It's when you have to do something, that is, give him directions to pick the stuff up, to clean up, to carry it over there, to put it in this place. Once you start giving directions, commands, this is where things start to fall apart. And what they found was that the high-stress parents, obviously used, well, not obviously, they used more negative behavior, also non-responding. That was very amazing. The non-responding behaviors were very predictive. The parent stress measures non-responding. That is, a child asks a question, doesn't do anything. Parent doesn't do anything. Praise, obviously, very negatively correlated to the parent stress scores. and questions very negatively. So what happens is, clearly, parents in this task situation behave very differently, either under a heavier load, and those parents who are highly stressed have the most dysfunctional behaviors. So that was their early work, and here's a summary chart of that work. Now, I was really delighted, but Charlotte Johnson and Eric Mash are from Calgary University in Canada, and I had met Eric at a conference, and we were sitting there just talking, and I didn't even know he was ever going to use the measure. He had picked it up at a presentation I gave about him developing this thing, and I never knew it. And so I don't remember who told me about his work, and then that's how I found out. So it was interesting. This is all of his and Charlotte's work. Well, in 1996, McKay and Pickens decided that they wanted to look at and extend the work. So this is a replication of Eric and Charlotte's work. And they went through, and what they did was, these are all observed parent-child interactions, again, videotaped, coded using the Marshak coding system. The things that they looked at were facial expression, quality of verbalizations, comforting, harshness, demanding behavior, body orientation, proximity seeking, and contingent responsiveness, etc. There are a number of other things that they were examining for. What they found was that the parenting stress child and parent domains were found to be significantly predictive of all the observed parent behaviors. They concluded that parenting stress predicts the quality of the observed parent-child interactions during the Marshak interaction situation. So it's interesting. Let me see if of the child domain scores, and if you correlated the child domain scores to the quality, the total Marshak quality index, which is the quality based on all those behaviors, the quality of the parent-child relationship. The child mood score was correlated 0.82, and the parent domain score, these are the highest of them all, was correlated 0.79. Okay. I think the important point to be made here is that that kind of correlations is probably similar to what you get for, remember what I said, the G factor of intelligence. You know, intelligence is correlated. The correlation of the total score of the PSI to the quality of relationship scores were in a range of 0.68. Well, that's about what you would expect if you want to predict college. Well, you won't even probably get that. I was going to say, take a person's IQ and try and predict their college grades, and you won't get 0.68. So PSI predicts the quality of relationship better than IQ. Testing predicts first-year college grades. Well, that we know why, guys. The variance is so restricted. You can't predict well when you restrict the variance, right? That's gimmick. Anyway, these two studies were really encouraging to me, and it supports the idea that the measure scores relate to real-world behaviors, which is really what you want to see. So I met Peter Lafreniere and at a conference, and he said, Dick, I really like the measure, but in Quebec, we can't use it because you can't use a measure in Quebec on the population unless you've established that it works in that population the way it does in English-speaking population. So he he got a big grant from the government in Quebec, and he undertook a major series of complex cross-cultural studies and to see how the PSI performs in the French-Canadian, French-speaking population. So we had to translate the test. So now you're now taking a measure, and you got to say how it's got to survive a translation, and it's got to communicate the same constructs in the new culture. Well, you'll find out, and I'm foreshadowing this, and you'll get it in your handout, actually all the languages. Currently, the PSI is in 42 languages and is published in 12 countries. And so it's used in a lot of different places. So what they did was, again, this is a videotape observational set of studies. What they looked at was they looked at observed transactions between parent and child. They looked at parental command, followed by compliance or non-compliance, followed by contingent approval or disapproval. Okay? So that's what they were looking for in their behavioral work. And then what they did was they looked at the conditional probabilities of the responses were related to the stress level. The findings, in short, are that the lower the parenting stress level, the more positive their behavior and their affect is towards the child, the more compliance they get from their children. And in fact, the low parent group, they divided their population in, the sample they had about, I think it was close to 400 parents involved. The bottom quartile was called low stress, and then the top quartile was the high stress, and then they had the middle group. And what they found was, in point of fact, that the low stress quartile had 3 to 4 times the number of contingent approval behaviors as the high stress. So one of the things they saw was also informing us about parent-child interaction, and that is that highly stressed people don't, when the child complies, they don't reward the child. They don't behave in ways that are useful to forming a better relationship. So that's important. Anyway, the next thing they had to do was they had to examine the cutoffs. So do the clinical cutoffs that are used in the U.S. work for the French-Canadian population? And they did. And they went through that, and they concluded, yes, we can use exactly the same cutoffs as they recommend in the U.S. for the French-Canadian population. One of the things they did in relation to that, they said, well, we have a list, and this was proposed not by them, but by the health department in Quebec, of a list. They had 10 variables that they felt was related to dysfunctional parenting or abuse. And they wanted to know what would happen. And what they found out that if you used the cutoff of the highest level of stress, 100% of those characteristics were found in the sample of the people who were included above the cutoff. And when you went down to what we call a borderline cutoff, it dropped down significantly, down to a little less than 70%. So they've used those ways of trying to validate the measure in a slightly different culture. So I'd like to stop for a moment because there's a lot of stuff going on. So if there's a question or a reaction so far, I'd really like to hear it. No? Oh, solid. Okay, well.
Shannon has a whole other question.
Yes, you did. Well, thank you. So I'll persist. Oh, please, if something comes up, really, I'd be delighted to speak about this stuff. So, okay, well, another study which was done in 2007 by Tripp and their group was an observational study of family interactions using the variables of engagement, communication, warmth. It involved the parenting stress index and the Beck depression scale. What was interesting was what obviously I'm going to be telling you, which is that the parenting stress was a significant predictor of all the interactional variables. But one interesting aside, which I want to comment on, is that the Beck depression scale in the regression analysis conducted was not predictive of any of the parenting behaviors. That doesn't make sense, okay? That doesn't mean that parents' depression is not related to the quality of the interactions with their children. I believe it reflects the fact that the parenting stress and depression share a great deal of variance. And it's likely that depression, the way it's measured by the Beck depression scale, does not have sufficiently proximal behaviors under consideration, okay, as the parenting stress does. So it doesn't capture, when you're trying to predict a parenting behavior, any unique additional variance. So in competition with the parenting stress index, it just drops out. It doesn't show. And that's part of why I said earlier that if you're interested in depression, you can't let parenting stress go into your analysis first. And what happens, and I made this recommendation to them, and they went back and looked at the data, and what they found was, yes, if you put in depression first, it will be a significant predictor, and then the PSI parents will predict additional variance. And both will be significant. So that doesn't mean that depression isn't related to parenting. It is. But it also talks about, and this is just a little aside, is that you have to, when you're reading articles, always pay attention to the kind of methodologies that's used. And because the same set of data could sound very differently depending on how you go about your analysis and interpretation. So that's for the students. Anyway, okay, so that's just trying to, and I think I'm done with trying to demonstrate that the parenting stress index does predict parent behavior. But what about the health of the mother? So I thought I'd go and do some really outlying ones. This is a study by Mellons and the group, and they conducted a longitudinal study of predictors of medical treatment adherence, okay, of mothers living with HIV. Now, this is the mother's adherence with her own medical treatment for the treatment of HIV, okay? So the predictive variables they used in the study were a mental health assessment using the epidemiological research interview. That was one. A family knowledge of the mother's illness, the adherence self-efficacy scale, addressing the intention and confidence of the individual mother that she's going to adhere. So that's what that scale is supposed to measure. Her confidence that she can follow it. The CD4 lymphocyte cell count, okay. The HIV RNA viral load, the substance abuse history of prior to the baseline, which is when this data was collected, the number of people in the person's home, and the parenting stress measure using the parental sense of competence subscale. They chose only to use that subscale. The follow-up prediction was 8 months after baseline. Only two variables, the lymphocyte counts and the PSI, were predictive of adherence with regard to taking the medication. The medication was given to them in a case wherein the dosage is when you take it, time is marked. Okay, and the index was the number of pills missed per day. That was the measure there. But it's interesting that while the lymphocyte count was predictive of the pills missed, only the parenting stress competence scale predict missed medical appointments. So here's a strange thing, and that's where I again think it relates to this G factor. It's a condition of the person that is under stress. Now, I'm sure these people have other things that they're obviously stressed, but even here, you have a variable that gives you some evidence of how powerful it might be if, in fact, it can take it out of the parenting and child transaction and still tells you it's measuring something that relates to how human beings function or don't function properly. So that was an interesting study. Now, I like these because they're pretty objective. This is the next study I'd like to talk to is one done by Ruth Feldman, and the neuropeptide oxytocin has been shown in other studies as both attenuating stress, the level, and being related to human bonding and attachment. So she knew that. So what she decided, though, was to say, I know it's related, the oxytocin is related to romantic stress in adults. I know that. But could it be related to parents' transactions with their infant children? So now they're going to look and see, could oxytocin be related to the transactions that the parents are having with their infant children? And what they did was they videotaped the transactions in a split screen so that they could see the child's face and the mother's face. And the result was they also asked each of the parents to provide saliva, blood plasma, urine samples just prior to the 15 minutes split screen transaction with their infant child. When the people completed the filming, they were then given the parenting stress index. The parent-child dyads were rated for what they call parent-infant synchrony. And what this really meant was the affective signals the face displayed, the gaze, the extent, the vocal harmonic of any sort. So that's the kind of transaction you're looking at. You're looking at that. A 4-month-old to 6-month-old interacting with their parents, both father and mother. Okay. What they found was that parenting stress was a significant predictor of interactive stress, which was defined as dissynchronous behaviors. So the index of dissynchronous behaviors, the more dissynchronous behaviors, the less harmony between the infant and the parent in their transactions, okay, the higher the stress scores obtained immediately following. Well, that was interesting. They weren't very high. I mean, the correlation was, 0.34 to, I think it was 0.4. Not very high, but it's still significant. That it could predict something as unusual as that. And the only other thing that was remarkable in this thing, and I think this calls for follow-up, is that this correlation was much lower when it was related to the father. That is, the father, excuse me, I'm saying something wrong here. The oxytocin level of the mothers was more correlated to the stress scores than the fathers. Okay. So that's a very interesting thing, and we don't know why that is. It may be that mothers are more sensitive to that face-to-face transaction with their infants than men are. They may be more skilled at making it work better. We don't know. But the oxytocin level of women was much more correlated to the level of stress that they had in their interaction with their infants. Interesting variable, but anyway, it's an interesting study. Well, so we know now that some oxytocin, cortisol, some of these more independently measured variables are clearly related to stress. So let's shift to a different domain of variables that I'd like to kind of suggest to you that the parenting stress is related to. And that is, whoops. Hold on. Oh, here it is. And that is the issue of compliance with medical care. Now, this is Gearson et al. In 2004 at Johns Hopkins University conducted a study with parents' adherence to the medical treatment of their children. What's important is that this is a kidney transplant project. So medical compliance is going to be related to what the parent does when the child's taken home. But this is important because there's a certain level of potential fatality or morbidity here that is not the same as you spill the milk and I'm mad at you. These were at-risk, medically at-risk children who had undergone a kidney transplant. The expected blood levels of the medications were assessed. The parents were given an electronic device that automatically recorded the time and date that each pill was administered. Or if it wasn't administered within 12 hours of the time it should have been, then the case locked that pill, and they were instructed medically to just go on with the next medication. So they knew exactly when the child got it, what the intervals were, they know what the blood levels are, and they know the number of pills that were or not given. The parental non-adherence group, their PSI scores were dramatically higher than the inherent adherence group. And among all the variables which were included were things such as the family environment scale, personality measures, the body image measures of the parents, child's behavior as reported at home, child's behavior reported in school. There were a variety of other variables. So what the authors concluded, and I'll quote them, it says at the end of their study, it was first and foremost the assessment of parenting stress, problematic parent-child interactions, and severe behavior problems should be carried out prior to transplant, and follow-up referrals for indicated interventions should strongly be encouraged. They went on to also say that they thought that parenting stress needs to be monitored periodically in this sample. Okay, so that's another area of, well, it can be somewhat useful and predictive in that realm. The next area, and then I'm going to watch the time here because we're getting close to our break. I know I'm wearing you down. I feel a little bit that way. But anyway, the last, well, not the last one, but within the compliance direction, is a study that looked at, this is a study which used the Incredible Years intervention, Webster Stratton's project, in a group of welfare parents. And what they're examining was the clinical cutoffs of the PSI short form in relation to dropping out of parents. Okay? And what they found was this was the result, that in terms of completers, they got about the PSI short form was about 85% accurate. In terms of dropouts, it was about 65% accurate. Okay. The importance, though, in their study was this is a population that's at risk for a lot of dysfunctional things. They have a project that they think is an evidence-based treatment that is effective. So how do you make it more effective? And if there was a way of identifying people who will undergo the treatment but who may need additional support. This is one of the uses of the PSI you'll see is to help us be more efficient in what we do. In other words, if you could kind of predict even a small portion of the people who are not going to be successful in treatment or are less likely to be, this gives you an opportunity to focus and to draw on that subsample. This is a study that was done on 904 mother and fathers in Cyprus. And it's an observational study, and they used latent profile analysis to identify 4 groups of callous, unemotional children. Okay. Now, we know there's a literature that suggests that children who display callous, unemotional characteristics tend to be related to conduct disorders in children. And what they did was examined it, creating the 4 groups, and they found no differences between either the mother or the father's relationships in terms of their stress scores to the 4 categories. They found that the higher the stress level, the greater the likelihood that the child would be in the high callous unemotional stress group. And so essentially what they found in their study was a linkage between stress level and children who display this characteristic of high callous unemotional traits, which I think is important because I think it does once again suggest that child outcomes, as the model was predicted early on, does relate to the stress level of the child and may be a function of their interaction. So with that, I'll conclude this part of our presentation. We'll get on to the clinical stuff by essentially saying that I think there's enough evidence to demonstrate that this is an important variable, that it relates to important outcomes, and it is reasonable to use it in clinical processes. But I think what we're going to do now is to really get down to talking a little bit more of the more practical issues of implementing the use of the measure. So let me say something that I just said. One of the questions that always comes up was, is this useful? Can I use it in my research? Because I'm working with Mexican-American people who are immigrants. And so everyone's population to them is absolutely unique. So therefore, you need to check out the validity. What I will point out is that the Parenting Stress Index measures a construct that is worldwide universal. The 42 languages it's in now, the fact that it's published in 12 countries like China, Portugal, Japan, France, United States. I mean, these are places that are not very similar. Egypt. So I think it's very robust across cultures, and there have been multiple replications of the factor structure. I mean, they're never perfect, but pretty close, and that's basically you get. Even if you took 2 samples of a U.S. population at 2 different places at 2 different times, you're never going to get the exact same results, but they're close enough to demonstrate the universalness. Okay, so let's talk about this, and then before we get on to cases, let me do this aside I mentioned, Jason. One of the comments that people often make is that, well, you know, I'm not sure how useful self-report measures are versus observational studies or observational measures. And I find this discussion to be kind of similar to what went on in the 1970s of the radical behaviorism movement, where basically, if you're concerned with this behavior, you focus on the behavior. What's going on inside the head of the person is not really important. Behavior, you focus on behavior, you change behavior, the other variables are not seen. Now, that seems to you right now absurd and simplistic. I know, because we've passed that era. But that was a big argument in the 70s. The radical behaviorism, that's what it was about. So I make that point. But if you look at behavior, and Jason and I were just commenting about this, and you try to predict anything, if you watch a mother on 4 or 5 occasions, what do you know? Well, it depends on the context. If she's supposed to be sitting by the side of a swimming pool watching her kid engage, what are you going to learn about their transaction? Okay? Not very much. Now you observe them teaching the child something. That might help you. You might see what they do in terms of questioning the child, providing information, limiting the behavior. But again, in what context? And will that predict if the mother will allow the child to go out and play independently? Maybe not. Who knows? So really the problem with all measurement and assessment is relevance to the context of behavior you're concerned about, and what way can you find a variable or a assessment that will give you information relative to a specific context, and will that translate into more than one context? And most observational behaviors haven't yet been proven to demonstrate that they can predict things across the kind of range of behaviors and variables that I've shown you so far the PSI can. So there may be a time when observation will catch up with self-report, but right now it doesn't look as though that's the case. And I think that's an important kind of thing to keep in the back of your mind, because I think sometimes the whole observational assessment models are oversold. They're important, but sometimes they're oversold. Well, okay, so let's talk about the clinical uses of the PSI. First of all, one of the most useful places is in triage, screening. Again, I'll give you an example. And this is very nice to be able to do this. I've been a consultant to the government of Bermuda on their population of children that are born, and they have a policy that all children who are born in their early years are screened for developmental, psychological issues. And they chose the PSI as one of the screening devices that they use. So every year about 800 kids are born. And why do that? Because they don't have the resources to provide guidance and counseling to every parent on the island. They recognize that if we can identify, early identification may help reduce mental health problems, behavioral problems, and various other kinds of things that are going to be important to our functioning in our society, their society. So they use it. So that's an example. There are some Head Start programs that use it under the same conditions. We have a psychologist, but we have 180 kids. We can't deal with all. So which cases might be the cases where we should help get services and support? So that whole triage and screening function is useful. The second thing that's real important is in using the PSI, and we'll talk about this as we go on cases, is for assessment planning. Well, when you get the results, if you use the PSI, some places do, as a first gate, that is, you give the test as the first thing that you do as part of almost the intake paperwork. It gives you a picture of all of those different variables: child characteristics, parent characteristics, spousal relationship, and you can begin to see which ones are the problem areas. So what tests or measures or questions or interviews or observations do you want to do to kind of follow up on the hints that that's telling you. So that's another use of the measure. I point out at the bottom of this file, the American Academy of Pediatrics Bright Futures Toolkit lists the PSI as among the mental health screening and assessment tools for use in primary care. How that happened, I have no idea. Truthfully, someone just informed me that they must have done some kind of review, and it was wound up put in their toolkit. So that is some of the uses. Oh, I have to go back. And so that relates to treatment planning and the evaluation. Now, in terms of treatment planning, if you look at the PSI subscales, you have to say, okay, what do I have to do? Well, if you have a very conflicted relationship and you're going to go along with a behavioral problem that you are going to require, or it's important to have the parents engaged, it might be before you start working on focusing on the children that you work on a parenting alliance and talk with the people about, okay, this is the treatment we're going to count, but here's what this is the load that it's going to put on your relationship. This is the demands that will make of you, and so let's talk about how you are going to be able to handle that. Okay. So again, you can see that by looking at the scores, and as we go more carefully, you'll see they will intersect with whatever the treatment model that you're going to use. Okay. So I want to talk just briefly, just to review quickly this, because we haven't talked about the nitty-gritty of the measure. Again, it's a questionnaire, paper and pencil. You can score it manually, okay? And you can plot the profiles, and you can interpret it based on what the manual tells you and what you learned in a workshop, and on the labels of the scale. So that's one level of analysis. There's another way you can use the PSI, and that is you can use it paper and pencil in the office, but you can take the scores and enter them into a computer program that will score, profile, and interpret the results. So you can get a report out to do that. When I was at Pediatric Associates, one of the things that came up, the pediatricians would ask, well, you've got to give me some information, some feedback if I'm going to make a referral based on the screening. So I began to write these little flow charts and had all of the form letters created, and then this is prior to the operation of computers and all the programming. This is the dark ages, not much past mimeographs and things like that. But anyway, that's where this program began. And so what I did was eventually write algorithms for the scoring. Now it's moved on to another generation. And the newest generation, the PSI-4, is an online administration. So you tell the client that they go to this website and enter this code, and they, from their home, can take the test. As soon as it's completed, okay, that you will get an email telling you the report is ready, and you go to that site, you click on the site, which is on your email, and you'll get the full report. So now it can be used. When we did it with Pediatric Associates, they were somewhat dependent upon the psychologists. Now they don't need us. If they use that model, they shortcut us, but progress results in different ways of doing. Yeah, certainly. But it goes back to the psychologist or the physician. If the physician is using it, and we have, in the publisher of the test, has put no limitation on physicians using this scale. We've written it and developed it so that it can be owned by the program. They can use it in their office, or they buy these, what they call tokens, which is really nothing more than code that you give to the client. So you can send an email to your client, and it will contain in it the URL, okay, and the code there to enter. And they do it, and up on the screen comes the test. They complete the test. Now, the report also tells you some things about whether the person took the test in a funky way, like if they pretty much answered everything down the middle or everything down the extreme, they really didn't take it serious. They completed it, which normally takes about 20 minutes, sometimes a little longer. If they completed it in 5 minutes, you can have reason to suspect the report. So you get that kind of information. And the report comes, and it's manageable and managed and may be edited, so that if you chose, as a psychologist who was using the measure, or as a physician, you could alter the report and send it to the parent so that they could see it themselves. Yeah.
Is that all HIPAA compliant?
Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's all HIPAA compliant. It's the most expensive way to use the test, candidly. But it's, I don't know, it's like, what is in a medical context, what does a medical lab test cost if it's, I don't even know exactly, so I'm going to say $5, $6. I don't know how that stands as compared to all other kinds of medical tests, but I'm suspecting it's pretty inexpensive. That is a way it can be used, it can be administered. The most recent, this is one of the problems with test development, I'll just go to the side, is that this edition 4 of the PSI had a certain number of changes that were made in it. Let's see if I have it here. No, I don't have it. Word clarification set, so we renormed it. And the danger of renorming it, the problem with renorming it, is that we had all this enormous database on edition 3, because the edition 3 protocol would take that profile and compare it to over 40 different known clinical profiles. We don't have that anymore because of the development. We have to wait now for the next 10 years or so to build up the research base that relates to that, because we changed the test. That's one. And and the other form would also did something else which was very useful, and they didn't do it in this case, and I don't know why, and that is it would allow you, when both parents took it, to superimpose the two onto the same profile. And now you have to do that manually. And then the third thing that they didn't include in the current edition, which gives you reasons why sometimes I almost incline to want the older one, is that it contained a reference list that was relative to the issue that you were dealing with. So if you were dealing with, say, child custody, okay, that's the issue. You would click child custody, and it would give you all the known published studies, the references to whatever clinical population you were dealing with. There was autism, you get all of that. So there are some. The new one, of course, gives you the online administration and all that stuff. But anyway, so that's the changes that took place, okay? So I'm going to now just talk about, before we begin looking at profiles and whatnot, just to comment on the child characteristics, so what they're supposed to be telling you. Okay. The distractibility hyperactivity relates to exactly what it says. The child seems to be more distractible, more active, and that is disturbing to the parent. Okay. This doesn't, yes, it is correlated, that subscale is correlated at about 0.75, 0.8 in that range with the Achenbach's scales, okay, total score. It's also related to the ADHD scale. I'm getting a drawing a blank on it now, but it's related to those scales as well. Substantially correlated, because in fact, in general, if a child is hyperactive or distractible, it's going to be distressing to parents. Adaptability was an interesting scale. That came out of the parents. One of the most common problems parents experience is, I can't get the child to do something differently, or I can't get him to transition out of his activity to something else. He's not very flexible, you know. So those changes, the lack of flexibility, and that's what that relates to, adaptability. You see this in autism, autistic children. You know, it's generally have very high scores on adaptability. They don't make the changes. The reinforces parent scale, people said, well, why would you want to do that? Where did that come from? Well, that came from basically both the research and the parents' input, which saying this parent-child doesn't reward the parent. They don't smile back at the parent. There isn't a reciprocity of coming to the parent. There's not the thanking. There's all of the behaviors that, as a parent, you got to get something back in the relationship. And so that's a very important thing, because if you don't feel reinforced by your child, and that the experience of being with that child is not very reinforcing, believe me, your behavior is going to be different than if, in fact, you find it very reinforcing to be there. So that relates to that, and that's an important. And sometimes as we get to that, you'll find that there are some parents who don't read their children very well, because there are some people who don't interpret that other individuals' behavior very well. They don't understand that sometimes proximity seeking is a way of saying, I like you, I want to be with you, where they may find that as annoying. Demanding this is really how much effort it's taking to manage the child's behavior. So kids who break rules, or who are putting a load on the parent for attention or for services. Clingy kids, very clinging kids, you'll find. It's just over. Yes? Yes. Yes.
Kids can be really demanding, and if you've accepted that and you're okay with that and you understand that that's your kid, or even the reinforcers parents, that might not stress you out as much.
Exactly.
At the time, like the kids think that you're may or may not change, but it's really the parents that wanted to understand your kid, those things may not stress you out.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. That's the focus of it. It's not that the behavior exists. It is, how does it impact you? Okay? Which is what life is about. It's about the interpretations of the world around you. If you can see the same behavior as being an act of kindness, and someone else can see the same behavior as an act of selfishness. And so we have to, if we're going to be, if we're saying we're tapping into distress, it always has to relate back to the impact on the person. Mood is basically crying, sadness. The acceptability versus the hoped for child. The acceptability scale relates to how is this the child that I hoped for? Is this the child that every parent's supposed to love and accept their children, except when they don't in real world, okay? And so this gives us a hint. If this is elevated, that the child's not found very, you've got a problem here that you may need to be a foci of treatment, because you may need to have the parent examine what their hoped-for child was, and you might have to go through some grieving work that relates to that this parent has suffered a loss, because this isn't the child that they envision. You'll see this sometimes in children who have serious physical conditions. Okay, the other thing I find is that most parents, by the way, I find to be fairly candid. Once you work with them, once they have the results in front of them, they become a lot more open. A lot of them, I think, allow themselves kind of to be caught, so to say, when you're screening. But so that's that. Sense of competence. This is not your overall sense of competence. This is a sense of competence in being a parent. Okay. So it's not so you got to interpret it in that way. It's not their overall sense of. So some very accomplished people. A couple of cases we're going to deal with. They're very accomplished people in what their work is. They may not know what the hell they're doing when it comes to raising a child, and that's very possible, and it happens. Social isolation relates to not having contacts, people you can talk to, get information from, people who can help you, a lack of connectedness. And we know that's real important, particularly in relation to abuse situations. That's important, being isolated. And now this one is we all talk about child attachment, the importance of attachment. Well, this is the other side of it. How connected the parent feels to the child. That is, one of the items is it goes like it takes a long time to develop a close relationship with your child. Or something like that. I can't even remember the exact wording, but that's about it. And so they're responding to that is how upset they are by that. Well, people who are upset by that, that's suggestive of that there may be a problem in their connection to the child. So that's important. Parental health is always important. That items, there are very few of them, but they relate to health and illness and whatnot, just to get a picture of where the physical health of the parent. Role restrictions relate to how being a parent takes you away from either the things you used to do or the things you like to do, but they restrict your degrees of freedom as a human being. So having a sick child does that a lot, because you're supposed to be a loving, caring person for this other human being, but it's every day. And it's hour after hour, and there's lots of disappointment. Everyone who knows the literature knows that we want to have people have children, but quality of marital relationship goes down after you have children. Very few couples wind up expressing the notion that they have a better relationship with their chosen person. That's well documented in the literature. So, that's an important consideration. So that's role restriction is you don't get to do what you want to do all the time or that you used to do, and that's a problem. Then there's the depression guilt, which is different than the Beck depression scale. This is really a kind of sense of sadness, a sense of responsibility, that when children aren't doing what they should be, somehow I'm responsible for it. It's a very negative sense of self-appraisal. And so that's important. And then the last one is the relationship with your parenting partner. This just talks to the parenting alliance. What kind of relationship there is there. One that says, we don't get to do as many things as we used to do. There is one question about interest in sex. So those are the scales. So how do we go about the interpretation process? Well, firstly of all, what I've tried to suggest in describing these subscales, that it's fairly literal. Those are meant to be, it's not like psychoneurotic. What the hell does that mean? Excuse me, but there are a lot of terms that we don't know how that translates into human transactions. Most of the DSM doesn't tell us a lot about, you have to know. You can't just use the label to help you understand. That's what it's supposed to be. We use clinical cutoffs of about the 90th percentile. It's so basically people who score on a given profile or a total score above 90th percentile. We want to interpret that in terms of its meaning. We also want to look at profiles. That is, we want to look at, okay, parent. Let's say the parent domain is pretty normal as the total score goes. But there's one or two that are really spiked up. Well, are they way up into the clinical range? Well, if they are, well, maybe we should follow up on that and find out how much of a problem that may really be. So elevations are important. And then again, with couples, it's the same thing. You have the same child, okay, two different parents, and the PSI helps you understand how they experience that child. And to the extent that there's a great deal of harmony in the perception, there's less likely to be as much conflict. So that's a way you're going to look at it when you get two profiles. And then, of course, the interpretation could be done by default, but as you just let the computer do it. And the computer does it based on my interpretations and my knowledge of it, because I wrote all the algorithms. So that's what that is. So here we go. Here's the first profile I'd like to talk about. So with your vast knowledge of all of the scales and potential meaning, what would you make of this? Oh, I can't. Oh, can't see that far. Okay, well, let me say that along the top is the name of the scales. The first one is, distractibility, adaptability, reinforced demanding mood, and acceptability, and then the last one is the total domain score. So that's not that visible back there. Can other people see them? Kind of. Okay. So yes, now you read it this way. Okay, just so we get it right. The higher the score, the more negative the interpretation is. So when you look at that scale, attachment is actually only one in the healthy range. So what we have here is like, if you get this profile, this person needs help immediately. This is a crisis profile. This is as bad as you're going to get. So the need for professional service is clear, because this person is saying everything is bad. I can't take this behavior. I don't like myself. I have a terrible relation with my spouse. Everything is bad. Now, sometimes you get this if a person's trying to fake bad, but there are very few contexts where parents do that. Okay? Most of the time what this is just that the person is totally overwhelmed. So. Yes. That's the one good thing in this whole profile, is this person still says, I'm connected to this child. This child matters to me. So where did this case come from? Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about it, and then we can go from there. This was a screen case. Okay, the child, that is through pediatrics a long time ago. It's a very old case. This kid was 2.5 years old, little girl named Christy, and this was a new patient to the practice. Okay, this young lady, the mother, was pregnant at 18. She dropped out of high school. She was married, and for 15 months, she and her husband lived with her mother and the grandmother. Okay. What happened was her husband, boyfriend, they actually weren't married at this point, decided to leave. And so she formed a new relationship. And with this new relationship, she got married, and she moved to a new city, Charlottesville. And for the first time, she's solely responsible for taking care of this child. I mean, she's 17 years old. She's got a mother and a grandmother in the house. They're taking care of the baby. So she moves away with the baby, and she's got to do the whole job by herself. And so what the mother says, once she was identified and referred, she tells the story of what her life circumstance was. And basically, this was one which raised a number of ethical and issue questions for me professionally, was because she would lose her temper, the mother, and this is self-reporting, and she would yell and scream at the child, often slap the child, okay? And she reports that one time, she said, it was only one time, I completely lost it, and I banged her head on the floor. So this woman knows that everything's out of control, okay? And this is a picture of everything's out of control. And so if we get this kind of a very elevated, almost everything's up high, that is an emergency case. In triaging, this is your first case. You got to push forward on this case because this person's in serious trouble, okay? One of the things that the PSI does, we've learned clinically and I've learned in the research, it doesn't have false positives. I mean, it's almost zero. So when you get people who are really elevated and give you that really odd thing, take it to mean that this is a problem, okay? False positives almost, now there are false negatives, and we can explain why some of these false negatives occur, okay? And there is a defensive scoring, a responding score that helps you with that. But anyway, that's the first one. So I'm really upset that we can't quite see that. I thought we could see it better, but we're going to move on. This is a situation where the PSI was administered on the basis of a self-referral, okay? This is a mother and father. They're married. The child is 3 years old. They came in, and both of them were there at the intake, and they describe the child-rearing practices they engage in, and they all seem pretty normal. And this was their profile. And if you try to make sense of this is the mother's, I believe it is. Yes. If you look at it, you'll say, well, what is going on? So what we have, if you look at the child domain, we have, that's where the major elevation is. The total score is not quite to the top 10%. The parent's domain, it's a valid protocol, even though it's relatively low, and the way I interpret that has to do with the fact that it's within the normal range, but it shows variance, so it's not like a faking good, everything is fine, you know. But so it's a fairly normal problem. This person probably wouldn't, if you use the total score, they wouldn't be picked up, okay? And they only would be picked up because of the fact that you have two highly elevated scores, and they have to deal with adaptability and the reinforcing parent. Okay. So the question is, why did they come in? Well, they came in because they're concerned about the child being very shy, avoids playing with other children, and is constantly expressing fear, different fears about things that are going to happen. Will that go bad? Why is the fire truck going? Why is that sound? Very apprehensive about the world. And part of the reason that really suggests that they came in, and Mother came in who led this group, was that she didn't know what to do. And that's seen in the confidence elevation. So what she's basically saying is that I'm having problems with my child. I don't really know what to do. Confidence is up, not into the clinical range, but that's her concern. And so the question is, how do we intervene in this case? What needs intervening? And according to the PSI scores, the things that need intervening is to work with the parents in terms of the issue of how adaptable the child is, what they expect of the child, the level of adaptability, and how they're perceiving the reinforcement of the child, how reinforcing the child is to them. Basically, when we took this case, we're trying to figure out how we would make sense of it. Well, what we came to learn was that the child appears to be very, very anxious. So we talked to the parents about treating this case as almost a separation type anxiety case, which basically is the anxiety of the child will be the focus of what we're going to do. And the child's trying to help the parent understand how the child's anxiety overwhelms their ability to do the things the parents expect them to do. And so we worked on it from that direction. All the PSI did for us on the self-referral was to kind of help us go further and to ask why the child wasn't reinforcing, what were the types of adaptability. In almost all cases, the lack of adaptability was child's fear, child being afraid. And so we wound up dealing with this as a case focused on anxiety. I don't want to go into that part, all of it, but that's all it told us. It couldn't tell us much more than that. But at least that's how we get. So this is a kind of almost run-of-the-mill case that you might get. Okay, so let me move it on and I don't know. I'm going to do this. So let me look at this case. So if you interpret this, what does this seem to suggest? Does it suggest anything? And it's demanding this is the one elevated scale into the clinical range, and it's very high. This is extraordinarily high. When it's up in the 99 plus percentile, that's very much a big issue. And the two left ones, and the one on the right, that's the elevation of the total child mean, which in this case is largely a function of the extremeness of the DE, of the demandingness. You see the other score. See all the other scores are at the clinical range or just below. The child's not very reinforcing. The distractibility and the adaptability are, just subclinical but borderline. And as far as the acceptability of the child, that's in a normal range. The child is kind of like what she had hoped, in a way. Many characteristics of the child are what she had hoped for. And when you look in the parent domain, the confidence is extraordinarily high. And again, restriction of role is very high, very high. So if we read it literally from the parent side, this parent's saying, I don't know I can't handle this. I'm not managing well, so we know we're going to have to deal with that sense in her. well, to find out a little bit about why everything is so restricted. Why is it she feel like the parenting role is so restricting to her? And the relationship with the spouse is pretty much normal. Attachment, health, all seem pretty normal. Not particularly isolated socially. So you go in and what's the story? Well, we take the profile and we sit down with the parents and we say, okay, it looks like these are the things that are really problems. And so the PSI screening in this case suggests that this may be a good case to be referred to the parenting clinic. Okay? Total score is above 90, etc. The pediatrician, on the other hand, says to us, this woman seems really poised. And very much in control. So what's going on? This is not what I would expect a referral to be. Why would the PSI pick this person up? And they were a little puzzled. We were a little puzzled. And so anyway, the referral was made to the parenting clinic. So I said to the woman, I remember this very candidly, I said, do you know why you were referred here? She said, yeah, I took the test and it says my scores are high and that I'm having problems. I said, well, yes, that's the reason. She says, thank goodness I need help. That's her first response. Thank goodness. Well, who is she? She's 33 years old, married at the age of 25. Okay. The child is 3.5. Okay. She's highly verbal, college graduate. She's had a career, very active, and worked with insurance companies, permanent on losses in different regions, did a lot of traveling with her career. She's married to a man who has an MBA, who runs his own business, which is very successful. And she says, I want you to know that John is the joy of our family and the bane of my existence. So I thought, well, okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, well, so I ask her about the joy, and she says that he is very smart, and he reads already. She's very proud of him, okay? He colors a lot of things, and mostly they look pretty. So she's pleased with that. So I said, well, tell me about the bane part. Tell me about that part. Well, when he misbehaves, the first thing he does is cries. And I'll tell him to do something, and he just won't do it. And then he'll start crying more and fall on the floor and screaming. He's having temper tantrums. And her response is, I don't want it to escalate. So I just say, it's okay, honey, it's okay, honey. So you see, this very smart woman is teaching this child how to misbehave and to get his way. I thought, well, God, this is really bad. So I said, well, there are other things. She says, well, yeah, sometimes when I'm on the couch, he'll say, move. Tell me to move. And I'll say, well, I want to sit there. So he would push her out of where she was sitting. She said, and I said, oh, well, he's 3.5. So I said, can you tell me any other things that he's been doing? She said, well, if I am eating something, he'll grab it out of my hand, or he'll grab food off my plate. So you obviously see this person has almost very little skills in what to do as a parent. But then I said to her, well, when you said, yeah, I needed help, it actually sounded like you were really very worried. And she said, yeah, I was very worried. And anyway, what followed this was a discussion of what she did to punish the child. And I asked her what things work. Well, she says nothing works. But she says, I'm thinking of spanking him, which she hasn't done. But this is the scary part. She says, I'm afraid that if I start hitting him, I'll never stop. So you see inside, she's so overwhelmed that there's a rage there that she knows to keep, and she's smart, she's intelligent, she knows, but her feelings inside are rage. Because she knows this is wrong. She just doesn't know what to do about it. So, anyway, we took this case on, and it was a very intensive work because she needed a lot of support, and it helped a lot that we had the tapes that whatever I said went to the husband. Bill Burke, who was a PhD, practices in Richmond, he was my graduate student at the time, so he was in on with this case, and he was to do the midweek phone calls to her. And what we did was to provide as much positive interpretation of what she was doing was, how heroic she was in the fact that she recognized how angry she was and how she could contain that. But this is the work that you had to do. And then we began talking about using work. And we explained to her the coercive escalation model and how that leads to conduct problems with children. She kind of grasped that. And she began to use strategies of a kind of a limited time out. So she made them so short that it could be successful. It would be just that, he didn't have to go and sit for 20 minutes. It was just an interruption, And she would essentially say, you go there now and you have to sit, and as soon as you're done and you stop crying and it's quiet and count to 10, then you can come back to where I am, and we're going to have something, some kind of reward or something. It didn't matter what they did. But the notion was compliance was important, even if it was limited, as long as he got used to being told when he had to go to timeout, he'd go. So we really made it real short. And she learned it, the technique, because I used to teach it all the time, to not, even at this age, you can explain it to a child by using it. We used this teddy bear, and we put the teddy bear, and we played the game, the teddy bear game. And so he would put the time out on the teddy bear, and we did this during happy times. And then she would praise him and whatnot. So he learned the system, and it worked. It was useful. They learned to do a better job of ignoring. I did find out that they used some other techniques that seemed to work. I wouldn't have recommended. She found one of the things that she found was punishing to the child, where she wouldn't exchange a gaze, and she used that as a punishment. I didn't recommend that, but yeah.
Related to this profile of the age of the child or clinic, how often do you see when kids are, carriage stress is higher for younger kids?
Generally.
Also decline.
Yeah,
General population declines a little bit over time across all the child, but when kids are like 2, 3, 4, how much of carriage stress is related to kind of typical temper tantrums on the time, grabbing food. That's something all 3-year-olds do, fight, whatever, and just not understanding that developmental expectations. Because we've had kids come into the clinic where parents are reporting loss of misbehavior, and those misbehaviors are very typical for their age, but not what parents expected. So you get a profile much like this with the actual 3-year-old. It's not that they're not doing the things that you said, it's just they're very typical for a 3-year-old.
Yeah, that's very, you're right. I would say, and that's why we used to use Lon Shackelford to our more long-term cases. We would refer them to Lon. So our model at the time when we were running the parenting clinic at that time was we thought we could deal with about 75 to 80% of all the cases came through because they were mainly of the sort that you're describing. They were highly disruptive problems, very upsetting to the parents, but not too far from the normal range of necessarily a psychopathology. Yeah, right. Yeah, and we'd get some of those too, because you get the ADHD. Yeah, but that, as you say, is very. One of in this particular woman's case, I have to say that she was an only child. She never babysat for anybody. She had zero experience of what to do with kids. And I will tell you an aside to this story, which is kind of humorous. The pediatrician I was working with, when I talked with him, said, well, you know, the only clue I had was one time she brought the kid in because she was very concerned that he made this whistling sound out of his nose. Well, the kid's nose was all encrusted and plugged up. And so he was having a problem breathing. So the guy who was the case, he's not in practice anymore, I won't name the doctor, but she became known as the case of non-terminal boogers. She just had to clean the kid's nose. But she could, I mean, it's so common sense for a highly educated person. You would think someone would just know that there's that crustiness and whatnot, you got to get it all cleaned out. It's restricting the airflow, and that's why it's whistling. But anyway, there was a case of the non-terminal boogers. This was some of the fun of being there. So anyway, so you can see what we did was this. The demanding of this kid was so spiked up and it was so high was really what was driving her crazy. And the other one was she's just found being a mother at home so confining to her prior life. And although she loves the kid and he's the joy of their life, he's the bane because in a sense, you know, she knows, she felt kind of trapped in the role, I have to do this now. Because she's not an immoral person, you know, or anything like that. And that was and that's where a lot of the stress was. And we worked on getting her actually a part-time job to get out. And she was convinced that if I got a part-time job, I could wind up paying for the care. And if I don't have to advance our family because her husband was doing well, all I need is respite. And that's what we defined it as. That's mama's respite. Contribute to the world, get respite, and you're going to be better. And I think that helped a lot. And so that's another kind of a situation. And I'm sorry about this. If I do this again, I'm going to have to do something. The only good thing is you will get this, if you want, the PowerPoint, which will have all the slides, and you'll see them more closely up, and and the rest of the content. So that'll be available. Okay, so. The next, any more questions on this? Comments? No? Okay. This particular profile is a case of a ADHD child. And this is a child who truly goes on to have ADHD. But what do we have here? We have extreme elevations, very extreme in the child domain, and the parent domains very low. I mean, it's extraordinarily low. For the parent domain, we're talking about the 7th percentile. This is an odd profile. What would you make of that? Well, look at the scores and the differences. The child, it's almost as though the parent is saying, do something about my child's ADHD, okay, and you can know this one because it's common. Basically, give him medicine. This is a give him medicine profile because he's the problem. We're fine. He's the problem. Give him medicine. Make those things come down. Make my life better. And basically, in this case, both parents, the father was 40, the mother was 37 years old, and the child was 5. Well established in their careers, and this is their first child. An accident is what I subsequently found out. This was not a planned pregnancy. So you're seeing that the child is the problem, is the way this child is viewed. The child's not reinforcing, they're not acceptable. The problem that we encountered with this thing was the referral came from a school psychologist who basically said, this is a probability that this child has ADHD based on what he did. So it was sent to the clinic. The idea there was, basically, let's see if we can fill out the picture of what could be done. And I think the issue is they came in for medicine. And we were very unsuccessful with this case. The parents, we laid out what would be a 6-week treatment program that we thought would be helpful to structure at home. We had planned some behavioral management, some charts and stuff like that. The parents both agreed. We explained to them what the treatment program was going to look like, how we were going to do everything, and I've described how we practiced to you. And they agreed that sounds good. So first session, the mother comes, the father doesn't come. After the first session, the mother calls and says, we don't think we're going to do this because I think the medicine is working. So they got what they wanted. And they came to the clinic. The child was a problem. They get the medicine. I've never had any follow-up on this, so I don't know whatever happened. Well, and the father never came. And in this case, when you have, this one attachment score, when you're trying to deny everything here, and the attachment score is elevated, that was actually a terrible sign. Because you could see the intent was to say there's nothing wrong with us, and still it leaked out that they didn't particularly attach to this child. And so that's what that looks like, and that's how it worked out. I hope the medicine did what they had hoped, and they went on. So that gives you the kind of range of it. But you see, the point I want to make here is just, you see there's a kind of literal interpretation, and that's what you want to do. You want to make, it's not that you believe that these interpretations are all reality, but the way I look at it is I take the profile, I sit down with the parent, and I say, can we talk about, this is what this profile elevation would suggest. Can you tell me more about why that might be? And that way, it's kind of like you're not just asking the questions directly, it's kind of engaged with them through their question and through their responses. And I find that works very well. I think there's something about the fact that the measure is there and we sit down together and look at it. And so anyway, so that's that one. And then I'm going to do a couple more and then we can talk. I wanted to just give you one this is an interesting case. It's a joint custody case. In this situation, the parents are divorced. Okay? The facts of this case are that the parents are divorced. And they have chosen to live about 2 blocks away from each other. The child, a little girl named Ann, lives 2 weeks with the father, 2 weeks with the mother. It's just an easy walk between the 2 houses. And on the weekends, they have alternating weekends. So 1 week is with the father, 1 week is with the mother. So this was their plan. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you any more about the couple. I want to talk about what this tells us. So the red profile is the father. Okay. So if you look at the red profile first, what it's saying is the father looks at this child, doesn't see it as a child as being distracted, doesn't see the child as not being very adaptable, basically finds himself not reinforced by this child, because that's the one of the peak elevation. Doesn't see the child as exceptionally demanding within normal limits, but says, is the child moody? And so we look into that and we find out kids crying is a big problem, sadness. And then acceptability, that's not so good. It's not in the clinical range, but there are things about this kid that the father doesn't particularly like. If you look in the parent domain, it's the only one in the kind of clinical range is the isolation. No, that's not isolation. That's attachment. So the father is saying, I don't have the senses of being connected to the child. Now, everything else is in a fairly normal range. The one point to be made, though, is that the father is the person who initiated this referral out of concern for the girl. I mean, she said there's some things aren't going right. So the other profile in black is the mother. And the mother says that there are two problem areas. One, the child's not very adaptable. And two, my husband is a horrible person. Okay? It's interesting that the father doesn't say, it's pretty normal in their relationship. So the father doesn't see his wife as a horrible person. So that becomes, kind of like the profile. So why, those are the points of disparity. So you want to come in and address those. Why do they see them as being different? Okay? And we begin to understand a little bit more about the situation. Okay. The mother is age 28. Okay. The child, I can't recall. I think it's 9 or 10. I don't remember Anne's name, the little girl, but 9 or 10. And the mother's view is that Anne is a normal child. The mother is working part-time, 30 hours a week, and she's going to community college because she wants to have a career and get educated. She is the individual who initiated the divorce. She said, I want out of this relationship. In general, her approach to Anne was permissive. She just let Anne do what Anne does. Not irresponsible, but generally on that permissive direction. The father, age 32, is a bank manager. He doesn't have a substantial income. He sees the alimony and child support and his wife's tuition as grossly unfair. He sees Anne as a normal child, and most of the time, but her temper tantrums are embarrassing, particularly when she is defiant to him in public. And he talks about that as being one of the things that she does that is most upsetting. He says, because I love this child, which the mother acknowledges. The mother said he seems to be attached and loves the child, but I don't really know what to do. He tries to set rules and expectations for her and expectations for her helpfulness. The mom doesn't have those same rules. So she goes to bed more when she wants to in the mother's house, and his house goes when he has rules of when she should go to bed, etc. He's gotten to struggle with her over a lot of these rules. So that's the relationship. when we interviewed them, one of the things that was clear was that the mother has her grievances, and we can't adjudicate all of this against the father. There was no infidelity or anything like that. But she wants to move on with her life. And the father is bringing this child in here because he wants to move on with his relationship with the daughter. Okay, so in a sense, you can see in this situation, the mother's profile is what we would call either, now I would say, because she doesn't elevate the child high like in the other one we saw, so she's not blaming the child. But she's saying, basically, everything is good with me, leave me alone. Which is really what she's wanted from her husband, leave me alone. I want to start a new life. So she didn't want the professionals. So basically, in long story short, he came in, she never followed up with treatment because she had enough on her plate. And her issues were minimizing everything because she was trying to engage in other things, which is fine. I mean, it's fine. So anyway, the father made the referral, he became the patient, not the patient, but the person we interacted with, and went from there. So again, you can see from this, you can't, you always have to pay attention to the relative elevations of things. The fact that she was very low in the parent domain, and there was one high score, that doesn't mean she was, as the prior art interpretation of being blaming the child or seeing the child as the primary problem. So, anyway, the mother's adaptability score, we asked her about. Why was the adaptability score so high? And she said, because when I ask her to do things, she just doesn't do it. But you see, his difference with the father was he then tries to do something about it. The mother's strategy is annoyance that the child won't cooperate, but I got other things. I got homework. I got work to do. So she didn't push it, and she just identified it. And that's okay. Anyway, that's a different type of protocol. Well, I think I'd like to stop here for a minute, and then we're getting close to the end at this point. Are there questions either about this one or the process in general?
I was just wondering if you found a specific child domain that was more highly elevated in preferred parents. Like, was there a child domain that seemed to drive more parents to come to the clinic if they
I don't really know. I can't answer that because I haven't made that observation. But I think once the people complete the test, they seem to be pretty much the same. You know what I mean? I don't think I notice it in the self. I can't really answer that. But okay. Yeah. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the defensiveness scale and
yes.
false negatives that you're referencing
Right.
earlier?
Yes. There is a defensiveness score, and that is if the person's score on that scale, which is a selection of items that come out of the parent domain, that is below 24, and there's an indication that the persons are really faking, minimizing or denying, okay? Now, occasionally, you'll get a score that low, and you will see that almost always in a situation when you're screening, because you're giving it to everyone in the population, where you have really a very competent parent. They happen to be, skilled, and they aren't stressed. So it's a legitimate thing. But when you see that, generally the child domain is also pretty down. Okay, and might be in the middle of the range with one or two spikes near the clinical 85th percentile, not the clinical, but that borderline range. But it's all pretty normal, and they may be a little lower. Where it becomes most noticeable to be faking bad, or faking good, is when the child is very, very high. There is almost no scatter in the parent domain, and the score is below 24. And in those, the items that are on that subscale selected are items that we found that when you give to the normative sample, and you take the continuum of it's a 5-point Likert scale, the mean is significantly above 3, which is the midpoint, which indicates that in a normative sample, most people will say, yeah, that's true. I find that difficult. Okay, but people who are trying to, fake good can't even admit what the average parent can admit. Yeah, that's difficult for me. So they stick with scores like 1 or 2, whereas the parents' average score in the norm sample is more like 3.5 or something like that. So that's a little bit of what those. I don't know if there's 6 or 7 items that we chose, and that was a separate validation process because we used that score and scale in relation to like the Marlowe Crown social desirability and lie scales on MMPI. So we kind of looked at those items in relation to some independent criteria. So in general, that's a bad indicator for outcome. It's also a bad indicator for treatment. Because if there is problems with the child that need to be done, this is a parent who's you're going to find is going to likely not be cooperative. Well, okay, so that is that. And then there's one last one, which is pretty obvious, but I thought it was interesting. This came in as a referral of a single woman by social services, and the issue was the child abuse potential. And the story is that the daycare provider noticed bruises of questionable origin on the child who's involved. The boy is 5'3", who is in child care. Mom says that this is his own roughhouse playing, and that he sometimes hurts his 2 sisters, one older, one younger. He's aggressive towards them, and a lot of the bruises on his arms, there were a lot of bruises on his arms, she says was because I grab him to stop him from hurting the other children. And so that's the story. And so social services made this referral and wanted to know, what's the potential for the child abuse to be here, and what do you see and whatnot. And this would be a case where just the demographic structure outside would suggest a possibility. So it's not too enlightening. But in this particular case, there's this, in relation to child abuse, there is this triumvirate of things, which is reinforces the parent elevation, acceptability, and the attachment scores. And when they're all 3 elevated, even if the other scores are lower, that's an increased risk because it suggests that the disconnection between the parent. If you work with abused people, they're all different, just like everybody else is different. But one I've found common theme is their thinking often includes the idea that what they do is kind of justified because he made me do it. I'm coping here. But if he just wouldn't do that, I wouldn't have done this. So, but I think that kind of thinking is more likely to occur when there is a lack of connection, attachment, or sense of reinforcement. Just as that other mother that I described earlier, she wanted to beat the kid, of course, but she had the connection that would override that. So, I think that's all the slides I want to present. I think I've taken a lot of your time, and I appreciate it. And are there questions about this or anything else that I can address? Yes. Oh. The publisher of the test is called Psychological Assessment Resources. Okay, and it's you can get, or you can PAR Inc. You can get there, and then they have all the information on it, and they are actually the copyright holders now. A while back, I sold it, got rid of it to them. And then the documents you're going to get is a variety of them, but one of them, when you go online, will also be this reference list, which is everything that I've talked about and a few more studies that I didn't get to. So